On today's episode, we'll be turning these rather ordinary slabs of walnut into a beautiful poker table. So elegant that you'll even invite your mother-in-law to sit at it. So join me as I get weird with wood. Hello everybody, this is Dan with Screaming Donkey Woodwork, and today I'm going to be working on a poker table that has two faces. And the whole time I was making it, this song Poker Face from Lady Gaga kept going through my head, and anytime it would come on the radio, I would sing Butterface instead of Poker Face. So we're going to go ahead and call this the Butterface table. I had these ordinary looking walnut slabs in the shop. They're all from the same tree, and I thought they would look pretty good as a table, especially in the style where I used the CNC and cut a pattern out of it. Initially, the client told me that they just wanted a poker table, and we were going to put some cool stuff in it and make it like a golf course themed poker table. They had some really cool ideas for it, and we're going to put the grass in and everything. But then kind of last minute, he informed me, oh yeah, we're going to flip the table over, so it needs to be reversible. That was a little bit of a shock to me, and I had to overcome and adapt. So after I threw a few things around the shop, I sat down and came up with a new design idea. One side had to be a badass poker table, and one side had to be a dining table, so I had to come up with a concept that would work for both. But I wanted the table also to be semi-transparent. And so that kind of killed me putting any golf-themed things in the table because it would all be upside down from the bottom. That's not the only problem. It's just kind of weird to be able to place it in the center of the table and isolate it. So like if you put a golf ball in, do you really want a golf ball in your dining table? Not really. You want it in the poker table side, so I would have had to pour a solid epoxy on one side and a not so solid epoxy on the other, and the solid side wouldn't have looked all that great. So after a bunch of whining and complaining, I think I came down with the idea to go ahead and make him poker chip holders that set into the table along with some cup holders. And just like every other woodworker hack, I do everything on the CNC machine. Look at this. This pattern is totally jacked up. So ideally, it would drill down each hole all the way to the bottom and then move on to the next one. No. That is son of a... All right, where was I before the dog started barking? Oh, that's right, I was talking about how the cut pattern was terrible. It should drill down, and it just went from hole to hole to hole, which made the cut take probably twice as long as it needed to. The moral of the story here, folks, is that it's time for me to upgrade my CNC software, because fixing this in easel would have taken longer than just letting everything finish cutting on the CNC. And I say this like I'm going to do something about it, but I'll be complaining about this in the next video too, I'm pretty sure. Here I'm gluing on some paint sticks so I can keep the spacing the same once I detach the table from the CNC machine and move it around. Normally this next part of the process doesn't take me all that long, but having to finish both sides of the table, this ended up taking the better part of a day. These slabs were a little bit warped, but when we do this process, it doesn't really matter all that much because it's going to sink down and there's going to be, such minor angles of deflection from it moving that we don't really have to change anything. Well, when you're doing the double-sided, you have to take care that both sides look really good. And for that to happen, the table has to be relatively flat when we pour it. Also, if it wasn't, I was going to lose a whole bunch of the thickness of the table, which in this case, that isn't a bad thing because this tabletop is going to be picked up and flipped. Do you really want a 200-pound tabletop to pick up and flip? No. So absolutely, I was going to have to make it thinner anyway, but I didn't want to end up with like a 3/4 inch top, so I had to flatten it out quite a bit. Now, the slabs are only a little warped, but that gets exacerbated. Is that right? Whatever. It gets made worse when you do the CNC cuts because all wood has a little bit of energy stored up in it. And when you make cuts and relieve some of the tensions holding it in place, it's going to spring back into the position where the energy is pushing toward. And the way that I'm cutting this makes it even worse because wood cannot compress. So where we cut it with the CNC and don't cut it all the way through it in this pattern, the bottom wood that's there can't compress, but the rest of it can definitely twist inward. So cutting it apart here will help it lie flat again. The white sheets that you see me working on top of is natural polyethylene. I'll put a link to it in the description of the video. And it is a key resource in the way that I make my molds. And you'll get a chance to see exactly how I make my molds here and why it takes me so much less time. This definitely is not the best mold making process for everyone, but it is the best mold making process for me. And that's because I'm always building something different and different shapes. And I make a couple tables a month. And if you're in that same boat, then it's a great mold making process and I suggest you try it. Now, if you're a DIYer, I don't suggest you do this unless you plan on making more than 4 tables, because the investment on the materials doesn't pay off till right about 3 tables. Because these sheets are about 3 times as expensive as melamine. I've been preaching the benefits of this mold making technique on TikTok for about 3 years now, and I'm just now starting to see other makers use this technique. And once they switch to it, they pretty much stick with it. It's a bit of a modification from what Black Forest does. Here I'm using the same 1/2-inch CNC bit that I used to cut it out to ensure that the spacing is all equal, and then I used a little bit of hot glue to hold everything into place. Again, normally I wouldn't have to do this, but since we are going to be finishing both sides of the table, the appearance of the bottom is important, so this has to be as flat as possible on the bottom too. Because if I was just doing the top, I would pour it, and then if I had any spots where I was flattening and there was still wood showing, I would just carve down a little bit deeper and backfill that with epoxy. So this went from a relatively simple process to one that I had to think about. There's also another problem where wood does not compress and epoxy shrinks. There's a 1/4 inch of wood across the entire bottom of this table, and there's a bunch of gaps above it where the epoxy is going to shrink. So for all intents and purposes, it's going to turn this into a rather large bowl because the bottom can't shrink, but the top sure can. This comes up anytime there's more wood on the bottom or the top of a table. Usually it's so minor that we don't really even consider it. You throw it into flattening, it fixes all of it, you're done. But in this case, there's so much more wood at the bottom that it is going to produce significant cupping. The good news is that I know that this cupping is coming and I know how to fix it. Well, I know now, spoiler alert, because it does work, but I can't say there wasn't at least one part of me that was panicking, knowing this was coming and worried that I wasn't going to be able to fix it properly. Because there's been a handful of times where the cut wasn't all the way through to the bottom, where I fixed the cupping temporarily, and then the epoxy got cold and the problem came back. When I was a kid, we used to have plastic rims for our bikes, and if it was a particularly hot day and you did a really hard trick on your bike, you had a potential to bend the rim. And if you did that, the way you would fix it was you would stick it in the freezer. And the reason this worked was because the plastic had a memory to it, and putting it in the freezer shrank the molecules back into their original position. Well, I find the same to be true with epoxy, but the same should definitely not be true with this table because those holes go all the way through, so we should get uniform shrinkage, which was also the name of my garage band when I was 13. Now, the plastic we're putting on the sides here is ultra-high molecular weight polyethylene, which is very similar to the natural polyethylene that we're using underneath. And I'm just going to go ahead and hot glue that into place. I say this all the time, so I feel like I'm sounding like a robot with this.
Beep boop bop beep boop bop.
This doesn't have to be sealed. It's just a structural glue up. You're not trying to prevent leaks here. You're just trying to make a wall strong enough where the pressure of the epoxy won't blow it out. I think we made like 6 or 7 of these little bridges, and it really just gives you a place to silicone to seal everything in. So I made an epic mistake in this build. I do lives every weekend, and I always show this, and we always guess how many leaks I'm going to get, because I always get leaks like this. There's some debate on that if I actually get leaks, but I'll explain further. So normally I use a clear silicone, and one of my regular watchers said, why not use a black, because it would contrast more against the white, and if you had any pinholes that you missed, you'd be able to see it better. And I thought, great idea, so I bought this huge case of black silicone caulk. So here's the flaw. I went to an unknown product and an unknown process and heavily invested in it. Not something I typically do, but I thought, hey, I know enough about this. It all sounds good. The logic is sound. Big mistake. This is what I consider the last part of the mold making process. I pour a bunch of tabletop epoxy down into the table, and what that does is it will seal up any pinholes that you may have overnight. Tabletop epoxy is much thicker than deep pour epoxy, so if there is a little tiny hole, you'll typically get a lot less leaking. Most of this is going to get cut off anyway because we only are really pouring it to the level that is at the bottom of the wood shelf that is left behind. But just in case there's any leftovers, we go ahead and hit it with a torch, which will pop all the bubbles that are in that tabletop epoxy. As always, we are using our Wisebond tabletop and deep pour epoxies. After a day of letting that tabletop epoxy cure, we're able to go ahead and mix up some deep pour epoxy, and I put way too much black in. I was getting to the bottom of my trans tint, and it was really hard to get it out with a syringe, so I thought, I could drip it in. And I've made this mistake 10 times before. I obviously need to be beaten at this point. So I just went ahead and mixed up another batch and split the difference between the two, and then we go on to degassing. Now, you don't necessarily have to do degassing with deep pour epoxies, or at least good deep pour epoxies. But I do it because I feel like it mixes the epoxy up a little bit more, and it's habit at this point. I don't want any of the micro bubbles that can come along with it. Now, here's the problem you could see with the caulk. You see all that white stuff on the edges? That is flex paste. And we use flex paste to stop leaks once we have made the pour. Not only does my new silicone take longer to cure, it's also very hard to see a hole in black silicone. But with all that flex paste, I lost maybe about 4 tablespoons of epoxy out of the table, and none of it hit the floor. So there's the debate on whether or not my molds actually leak. So is that actually a leak? I say no, because to me a leak is when I get it on the floor. This was the worst leaking one I've ever had with this process, and it took 15 minutes to clean up. And since we're talking about mistakes, why not just skip dogging down the table when I'm going to cut out the final round shape? If I didn't feel stupid enough before with the caulk incident, I sure feel stupid enough after this one. So the best thing to do is just to ignore things like this and act like they didn't happen. We'll come back to this, but I'll be quiet now so you can enjoy the wonderful sounds of demolding. So we reset up and recut out the final shape, keeping the same dimensions. I didn't shrink it down to hide my mistake. The best part of making a mistake like this is you get to think back of all the other people's mistakes that you've watched and be like, how could you have missed that when you're watching them on YouTube? And then you make a great one yourself, and then you think, well, that's how they made it because they're just as dumb as I am. So now it's flattened on one side. We got it out of the mold, and just as predicted, it is a giant bowl. What I want to do here is take off all of the wood on the bottom without taking off all of the thickness so I can flatten it back out again. I know that doesn't make any sense, but it will here in a second. But first we get to play with it like it's a giant cookie. We're still a little over 1.5 inches thick here. Table's heavier than I'd want it to be. It would still be a little bit of an issue for 2 normal sized people to flip. The simple solution to that is to keep making it thinner, but the way that my brain works is that if it's too thin, it starts to look cheap. So I want to keep it a little bit over an inch thick. That'll be heavy enough so it doesn't move around easily, but light enough for two people to flip relatively easily. I decided to do all this flattening by hand so I didn't take off too much material. I mean, not by hand, by CNC, but I'm pushing the buttons and controlling it, damn it. And as no surprise, the center clears out the first. So then I start taking lower level progressions across each one of the edges. And it's hard to see from this angle, but I try to get a better angle so you can see it a little better here. And I've kind of made like a pyramid from it, with each progression being about 1/8 of an inch. If I would have just went back and flattened this until that was all even, I would have lost 3/8 of an inch off of both sides. And then I would have another problem. If the table were to get cold, it would reform a bowl in the opposite direction. So what we're going to do now is flatten it back out to its original position using some sunlight. It's not really the original position. It's the original position that it wanted to be in, but couldn't because the wood was there preventing it from shrinking more. So to do this, I just got to wait for a sunny day, pop some black plastic on it, seal it up as well as I want to, and then put some weight on it where I want it to go the other way. And in this case, we just used buckets filled with water. With that sitting out in the sun, we also had some little end tables to match that we needed to make, so we went ahead and started milling up the wood for that. You might wonder who we is, because pretty much this video has been all me, but I trust there is an associate woodworker somewhere behind me in all of these shots. And I got a new Festool sander, so I decided to play with it a little bit. And then we went right into flattening. All of this is pretty much all the same steps that we went through to make the tabletop. They're just a lot smaller, so the whole process went a whole hell of a lot faster. After our tabletop was flattened out, we took it back and finally actually flattened the bottom of it, and I can tell you that the edges were about the same height as the center. My little pyramid scheme worked fantastic. Should I call this wood MLM from here on out? It could be like a little gatekeeper thing that I do. Just call it wood MLM. Waiting for people to ask what that means, and I'd be like, it's my pyramid scheme. Duh. While the top was flattening, it was a good time to go ahead and cut these end tables down to a size that would fit in the molds. While you're watching this, if you could figure out a better way for me to do this, I would appreciate the help. I had to have the clamps on there, but if I would have clamped this to the table, the saw would have run into the clamp. And before you say just put some foam on there, it won't go on there with the clamps on. And I had to have those clamps on. There was no way I trusted my hand to hold it in place while I ran the saw across to get the cut I wanted. The only possible fix I could see to this was taking a screw and just drilling it into the bench, but I didn't want to do that. I seem to run into that scenario a whole lot where I have to have the clamps on for the guide, but I don't have enough room then to clamp it down to the work surface. Though, as I said that, I got that sinking pit in my stomach because I realized the answer is those super expensive vacuum clamps from Festool. The only big purchases I have left are obviously a table saw, and I need a much larger bandsaw. But just because I can afford them now doesn't mean that I don't want to throw up just thinking about purchasing them. We got our little tables into the mold, and we are repurposing our water buckets, along with helping to stabilize keeping our table flat. And we'll pour everything on the CNC machine because I am out of space in my shop. And finally, my associate woodworker, Becca, makes an appearance and contributes something to this project. You'll hear it drop when it does.
I know. Should you hit the sides too?
Just the bottom.
There you go. I can hear the difference.
These molds are great because from there we could just run it through the planer and take off all of that extra wood that's on the bottom. And they're so small we really don't have to worry about the same bowl effect that we had with the large table. Now's a good time to say that if it ain't cool, I don't make it. And right now our poker table is a little boring. Not too long ago I watched another maker make some wooden poker chip holders, and I figured I could do the same thing, but one better. I could make it so they're stackable and make it so they would embed in the table. So I did this with the idea that I would use a flush trim bit to take out all of the extra material. Little did I know, It was too much material to take out, and it was bouncing it all around. Well, we did make a test piece first and figured it out that way. The right answer would have been to have an extension for my drill. So I did order one, but while I was waiting for it, I decided to try this method because we made a couple of extras just to test things out to make sure it came out perfect. And this worked very, very well. The benchtop sander was darn near the perfect tool. So I took the end rails and used my discount donkey marking gauge and made a couple of X's on there to see where I would sand to, and then just used that as a guide to make like the finger slots. Before I could glue those sides on, I wanted to cut out a little bit of the bottom with this oversized cylinder so that the chip racks would be nesting. Just by eye, I followed some marks I made on the side with my marking gauge. And the oversized cylinder would account for any misalignments or depth screw-ups that I had. While Becca spent some time assembling the chip racks, I went over to the butterface table and I flush trimmed the edge. I saw John Malecki do a review on this Wen plunge router, and he was talking about, oh yeah, it would be great if it would come with dust collection. Well, mine came with dust collection. I'm not sure where he got his from. I'm sure the Festo one is much nicer, but that one works great, and it fits great in my giant gorilla hands. So now I'm planning on putting the cup holders and the chip holders into the table, but I wanted to make sure that we had the right size cuts. So we made a test cut on some scrap wood that I had. More like garbage maple that was left over from another project. Couple of quick test fits and everything looks like it just barely fits in there, which is what we're going for. There will be a little bit more play there after sanding. The cup holders also fit perfect, but they're just a little tall, but we can fix that. So before cutting these on the CNC, we properly dogged our table down this time, and then made a prayer to baby Jesus just to ensure that I programmed it the right way. Dear baby Jesus, please guide my hands in the formation of this G-code. And with how it turned out, it seemed like baby Jesus was definitely listening that day. Now it's time to fix the screw-up that I made by not properly dogging down the table. So here I had a few options. The first one was rage quit and throw the whole table away. The second one was to try to match the wood and fill the gaps in with matched as close to possible wood. The third was to chisel more out and make it look like natural rot. And the fourth was to pour the epoxy and see how it blended. I figured I could always come back and make it look like rot if it didn't look good. The customer is going to see this screw up. It's there. It's on YouTube. It's on TikTok for everyone to see. He probably watched it in the live when I made the air. It's not going to change the fact that I made it. But there's imperfections in the wood that we left in too. There are differences between the live edges. There are beetle holes and nail holes that look unnatural. So what I thought was this. I'll fill it in, and then I'll call my wife out and ask her, can you tell where I screwed this up? And she pointed to a large beetle hole and a place where the live edge looked a little bit unnatural, but she did not point to the spot that I screwed up, so the customer is getting a subpar product. As practical as I can be about this, I know that the customer doesn't care, and I know that I shouldn't care, but I do care. I hate when anything is messed up. This is why I could not do finished woodwork until I was in my 40s, because I could not accept that things could not be perfect and still be great. There are at least 25 things I could point out in any given product that I make that isn't up to what I wish it was. Every time you do it, you get a little closer to perfection, but it's not achievable. The blend-in that I did by meshing the two boards together, they came from the same tree, the opposite sides of the same cut. I put them in. Nobody could tell that I did the blend-in there, but I knew it was there. I could see, and maybe even my mind made it up, the slight imperfection in the grain lineup. And I swear it was like a millionth of a shade off. Here's another one. Anything you fill it in with is not going to be perfect. You use CA glue. You might not be able to see it with your naked eye. You use epoxy, match the same color. There's a chance that you might see a slight line between it. With a UV, I can't go back and tell you exactly where every single spot I filled in was, except when you're sanding it or you put a UV light on the table after the fact. So it may be imperceptible, but it's not perfect. In everything that I'm passionate about, I'm driven to be the absolute best. I want to be the best at these things that I do. That's why I'm always experimenting and trying new things. I'm just saying it took a long time to realize that it's okay not to be the best. It's okay not to be perfect. I mean, in my head, it'll never be okay to not strive for perfection. I think this is why so many of us gravitate toward the things that we're already good at. And I think it's why I'm probably the odd man out with neurotypical people. I always have the I want to live forever argument with my wife, and she's like, no, definitely do not want to live forever. My reasoning isn't fear of death, it's more a fear of missing out. There are so many different things that I want to do and learn that I just don't feel like I can cram it all into one lifetime. So while most people are striving to find that thing that will make them content in life, I'm striving to learn a new thing all the time. For me, it's like, let's try the new thing. What's the worst that could happen? With the exception of movies, like if I'm going to sit down and watch a movie and we're trying to guess if a new movie is going to be good, or we could just watch a movie that I know is good, my preference is to watch the movie that I know is good. So that's what getting a little bit older did for me. Instead of looking for a brand new thing to try to learn, I try to find new techniques to learn in something that I already know. Even in this dueling and sanding that we had going on, I was trying to figure out what was the best technique, who was getting through it faster, which sander was faster. And at the end, I had a lot of data, but no decision. By all intents and purposes, Becca had the better sander, but I had the better technique, so we went at about the same speed. But then I switched over to the better sander, and I went at about the same speed. I was hoping to have that definitive moment where I could say, yes, my investment in this Festool sander was worth it. And don't get me wrong, it definitely was. But the 3M kept up with it more than what I expected. The reason the Festool is worth the investment is because I've had to return those 3M sanders to get repaired because they have a problem with the heat sinks on them. But when it's working well, I couldn't really tell much of a difference in the amount of material that I was able to take off. I do, however, think that the Festool dust extraction is better than that of the 3M. And I liken that to the difference between my drum sander and my planer. With a good dust extractor on my drum sander, it gets out all the dust. With nothing on my planer, it is going to shoot all of the dust out the back side of it. If you ever want to see how good the dust extraction is on that Festool, just take the vacuum hose off and it'll shoot a steady plume of dust out the back of it. Here is an excellent example of me not thinking things through all the way before I started doing them. I had to come up with a way to block the light from coming in from the bottom from these pockets. And I think the black epoxy was the right solution, just more or less because of how easy it would be to clean. But I really should have thought this out more when it came to the cup holders, because I still had to put the brass in there for the cup holders, and with the black epoxy poured on the bottom, now I was going to have to put the cup holder on top of it and then reseal it in with black epoxy. So I wish I just would have sat down and thought about the cup holders a little bit more before I made this first pour, but it became super evident to me right after I did it. So I wasted some tabletop epoxy because we just let it harden up while we were going ahead and cutting our cup holders. I was really worried about cutting these because I just saw Jason from Bourbon Moth have a complaint that the brass item that he bought wasn't brass all the way through. A bit of me was anticipating that the cut would not be achievable with the multi-tool because it would not be brass all the way through. But it was, so we made the cuts without a vent, and then Becca filed them down just so we wouldn't cut our hands as we were sticking it down into the table. And now that we were thinking about things a little bit more, we decided to go ahead and put the finish around the hole so we wouldn't have to press finish up into the lip of the cup holder. I wasn't so much concerned with the dye from the finish getting on the brass. I was more concerned that there would be a weird little lip between the brass and the finish. I figured if there was an overlap line from putting the finish down, I could sand that area and it wouldn't be too bad, and I would know underneath that at least there was finish under there and there wouldn't be a weird little lip. So we put our cup holder liner, I guess you would call it now, and it fit snug as a bug in a rug. Grabbed our epoxy and we went ahead and filled up a little tiny bit of the bottom. It's only about an 1/8 inch that we ended up with there, and then we go ahead and spread it out using the heat. The torch not only helps the epoxy spread out nice and evenly, but it also pops all the bubbles that are in that tabletop epoxy. And while I was busy doing that 6 more times, Becca was rounding over the edges on our little end tables. And that was Becca's first time ever using the router to do a round over, so if you think her technique looked a little bit weird, it probably did. But she did a fantastic job with it, and that'll improve over time. I don't think a lot of people realize that routers are second only to saws and wood shop injuries. So very dangerous tool. Better to look a little awkward and be safe than to have an awesome style and technique and hurt yourself. All right, I decided to finish this with a walnut colored Natura. which I have only now just decided that it's probably a little bit closer to Osmo than it is to Rubio. It works very well, but there are two minor inconveniences that I probably need to bring up with it. I found that it works a little bit better if you give it a little bit more time to rest. So with Rubio, you put it on 15 minutes later, you wipe it off. With this, I would go 30 minutes to an hour. For me, that's not a big deal, but if it is for you, you probably want to think that one through. The other one is pooling. You definitely want to do a final wipe down of this with a very quick motion. And that's because if you leave your hand anywhere through the rag that you're using to wipe it off, you will get a slight amount of pooling. The only time I would see this as an issue is when you're doing a larger table and you kind of got to lean over the table and plant your hand. When you go back over that area where you planted your hand, you want to do a quick wipe of anywhere where you did plant your hand. And that is the reason why I said it's more similar to Osmo than Rubio, because you have to do the exact same thing with Osmo. I'm showing this part in reverse order, primarily for dramatic effect, so you see the poker side last. And as you can see, I have a couple of Coke cans holding it up on the table. We just put them in the cup holders, and we use those to space it, so we wouldn't have to put any spacers on it, because both sides of the table need to be perfect. But some hilarity did ensue while I was trying to get those Coke cans into the table. I had Mrs. Donkey out in the shop with me and asked her to hand me the Coke can. And I had 4 unopened ones that were out there so they could hold the pressure, and one that I was drinking from. Well, I was holding the table up with one hand and reached back and grabbed the other Coke can, and she handed me the empty one. I didn't really look or squeeze the can to feel if it was full or empty. And I stuck it under and it immediately crushed it. And for the next 20 seconds, all I could think was, oh my God, I need to put this back up on the CNC machine. It's way too heavy still. And this is the poker side, which in my opinion is the cooler of the two sides. And we messed around with this layout forever, trying to make sure that it made sense. So here's the idea. You sit in the empty spot, your drink goes to the right, and your poker tray goes to the left. There's no elbow bar on the table, so it's important that I round it over the edges so it would be softer on your wrists and arms. An elbow bar also acts as a backstop for the cards so you don't deal the cards off the table. But in this case, the chip holders would act as the backstop that you would aim for your dealing. And I can't help but think to imagine that at some point, one of these chip holder slots is going to be filled with Cheerios. So it's a good thing that Wisebond is safe for food contact. All in all, I am very happy with how this table turned out. If I were to make myself a poker table, this is the poker table I would have made myself. I'm hoping the customer gets some great nights of poker and some family game nights out of this table for many years to come. He's going to be building the detachable base himself. I have some ideas, so I'm hoping that he consults me on it before he does it. The last thing to happen is some nano coating to prevent from those nasty spills that can happen on any dining table. And here's our final product with the chip holders in. I've got a bunch more content coming up, including a xenomorph table, a magical wizard of some sort table. I'm even making some sort of keepsake box. I even make these funny, weird commercials.
For years, we have always thought of a butterface as a pretty woman with pads of butter on her face. Screaming Donkey is about to change that perception with the Butterface Table. Fancy enough to impress even your dopest friends.
Pardon me, but would you happen to have any Grey Poupon?
But of course.
Wait, where did you pull that out of? I am thoroughly disgusted.
Grey Poupon, so fancy it comes in a plastic squeeze bottle.
Get over yourself, Becca. I saw you pay with tacos with money you pulled out of your bra.
These bitches always trying to take my money.
I raised to 18,000.
Come out, bitch.
Suck it, losers.
Butterface, is it a poker table or is it a dining table? It all looks good. Butterface.
I'm out, bitch.
So if you like stupid stuff like that or just enjoy watching the wood making process, at this point I ask you to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time, get weird with wood. If you like what you saw, check out more of our crazy content here. I mean, you're this deep into it. What else are you going to be doing? Tallying up all the responsibilities you're ignoring, pining over that chance encounter you had when you were 17, calling bowling alleys to see if they have 16-pound balls, winning like Charlie Sheen.